Hi, I'm so happy to greet all of you, and I hope you're having a wonderful time at the convention. So I wanted to share a few thoughts on a topic that is of great interest to me. You know, this is an important celebration anniversary year. I know you think I'm talking about Theriault's 50th anniversary, but actually I'm not. I'm talking about the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave American women the right to finally vote nationally in all of our elections. This is 150 years after the Constitution was signed. This is 72 years after the first suffrage rally in Seneca Falls, New York. And finally, in August of 1920, 100 years ago, the 19th Amendment was ratified in Congress. It was quite a battle. And I want to talk about how this relates to our world of dolls. Last year, I gave a talk at convention that I called It's Just Stuff. And people were kind of horrified because I was saying that their dolls were just stuff. But my picture was bigger than that. I wanted to talk about the importance of seeing dolls in a bigger picture than just simply as an object, which could be no different than a pot on your stove or a tree branch in the garden. A doll would just be a thing. It would just be stuff, unless you saw it in a much broader field, the history of that particular doll, the time in which the doll was created and what might have been the social forces around the doll that helped in its creation, how the doll was marketed, how it's lived since that time. So after I left there, this has really kind of enveloped all of my thinking over the past year in terms of how I'm seeing dolls, because I'm trying to see them all in a much broader perspective every time I pick up a doll and handle it and catalog it. And I'm looking at it in a wider perspective. And then that brings us back to the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Once again, repeating, nearly 150 years after our Declaration of Independence. We finally had the right to vote. Still haven't had a women president yet, but those good days will be coming. Now, so I started to think about the history of dolls and how it might have related to the entire suffrage movement. And I wanted to have a few thoughts in that matter. I've kind of just been reading on and off about it for the past 6 months, and I've got so much information and so many ideas going that you might see me start to ramble at some point, because I sort of go off onto a tangent of things that I think would really be important. But I'm going to throw some ideas out there, and hopefully that all of you will get involved and will start to develop and take any one of these off on your own little tangent and develop it further. Furthermore, I was thinking, because at our Facebook, our live, I don't know what you call them, our happy hour Facebook groups that we have on Wednesday evenings, someone proposed a topic sometime once about thematic auctions. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be great to have a thematic auction related to the suffrage movement? Any of the women artists who might have been heavily involved in this and some of the dolls that they created. Any dolls that were actually made as a suffrage doll. And I found examples of them ranging from a wonderful folk art doll, to the Albert Mark doll that we sold, which was wearing a suffragette costume of one of the very, very famous British suffragettes. So lots of angles that we could go into this. But I wanted to think about how the suffrage movement fit into the history of dolls. And after all of it, I've finally come down and I've divided it into 3 areas. Now, nothing is set in stone and eras overlap. Always please remember that life is not simple. We can't totally categorize things, but we can make broad pictures of how this would be done. So I call the first era the women doll makers and the rumblings of the progressive era, 1875 to 1900. I'll come back and talk about each of these individually. As second era, I called women doll makers in the heyday of the suffrage movement, 1900 to 1920, and doll makers and the aftermath, those who benefited, 1920 to 1940. And I've chosen 3 women that I thought of that were during this time, and I know that they were right at right at the heyday, the peak of the suffrage movement. And I went back and tried to study their lives and study the dolls they made and the environment they lived in. And those three people are, and you're seeing photographs of them here, Rose O'Neill, Grace Drayton, and then Grace Story Putnam. So three women who were important American female doll makers with an art background coming to us at the beginning of the 1900s. So let's talk about Era 1 first of all, and that would be women doll makers and the rumblings of the progressive era, 1875 to 1900. This was a really interesting time for me. Lots of things were happening in America. First of all, the 1890s were the Gilded Age, and there was a lot of money to be spent in America, and a lot of things were happening. But even prior to that, there was a rapid development of the industrial movement. There was affluence. There was just a changing, rumbling times that were going on. The magazine industry began to be developed, and remember this because this is very, very important in the second era that I'll be talking about. So what happened with female doll makers during this time? What was their environment like? What did they do? Well, I tried to go back and think of all of the people that I would know, and I kind of honed in on Martha Chase as being an example of someone who probably exemplified most of any of the others, from Isaiah Walker to Ella Smith to the Adams sisters in New York State. But to me, Martha Chase really kind of exemplified what had happened here. She was right between two eras. She was coming in from the era of Isaiah Walker, where things were made in the home. Everything was made in the home, beginning with sewing. This is how so many of the women doll makers from this era began their career. They were seamstresses, or at the very least, they did sewing for their own homes, for their own children, or for the dolls of their children. And that's how Martha Chase began, for example. She had a doll, and she wanted to get a costume for the doll that she had made. So she took her doll that she'd made, her little cloth doll, and she took it into Boston to stores, and someone in one of the stores thought, gee, that's a great doll, and we could market that, and the story blossoms from there. But throughout her entire career of building this cottage industry, a couple of things remained constant. Number one, she was highly involved in her business. It was not a big corporate structure where she sat in the fancy office and told people what to do. She was involved in the day-to-day of the business, hands-on all the time. Number two, the whole business was family-oriented. Not highly structured. People did not have specific roles that they were assigned to do, but everyone was involved in the making of the doll. And they used the traditional skills of sewing. But even more, during this time, roles of men and women in society were very, very highly divided. Men were the breadwinners, women kept the home. And so for a woman to develop a business, to be a doll maker during this time, she had to have something that fit within this plan of what her role in society was. What could be more natural than having a doll business where you made dolls and you had your own little shop called a doll's house in the backyard of your house? And that's what Martha Chase had. Very, very, very unique to that time period. The business kind of grew accidentally. No business plan in mind, just word of mouth growing, people liking the product, demanding more, and her producing more. The distribution was very personal as well. She didn't have a lot of distribution out on the road. She didn't have promoters, and that was very, very indicative of this time period. And I haven't spent too much time on this because I really wanted you to see that this was the beginning, the growth of what was to happen during our era number 2, women doll makers, and the heyday of the suffrage movement. Now, the suffrage drive had been going on prior to this time, no question of that, in America. And actually, New England, New York states were kind of the center, a lot of these movements that were going on. However, I will point out to you that one of the first states to have voting rights for women was California in 1917, and some of the western states even prior to that. So even though there were rumblings in New York and New England states, there was more acceptance as you went further west of women's role in society. So this had all been going on during Martha Chase's time, but we have no evidence that she was involved in anything having to do with the suffrage movement, although if someone ever came up with something, wow, that would be a great research tack to go on. So get on it, folks, and let's see if we can find something. So during this era, too, the women doll makers, in the heyday of the suffrage movement, here's a couple things that were happening. It was a changing world now. It really was. One of the big things that happened, and one of the biggest boosts to women becoming doll artists who were also involved in the suffrage movement, was a rapid development and growth of the magazine industry. This cannot be underestimated in any way. We are so tuned into everything being photographic today that people don't tend to think of illustrations. But these magazines, they were blossoming overnight. Everybody wanted them, and there were lots of them. And guess what they needed? They needed illustrations. They needed illustrators. And all of a sudden, women who had been coming out of these new schools of art for women that were also developing at the same time, this was a market for them. This was a place for them to have a bit of financial success of their own. And so it was a win-win situation. Women were coming into the marketplace at this point with their artistic skills, with their ability to illustrate and produce wonderful works of art, and the magazines and journals were hungry to have them. So it was a really important thing. There was also a great consumer demand for new products at this time, for things that were different. All of this led to the great interest in the new dolls that were going to be created. And there was a rapid development of the American doll market as well. The dolls being made in America during this time. For example, do you know what began in 1903? The New York Toy Fair. It did not become international in its name until some years later. In 1903, the New York Toy Fair opened up. And so suddenly all of these American artists, most of them women, had a new venue to produce their arts. Now, although many of the women flourished, their work overlapped into many areas outside of dolls. And I'll tell you people, for example, let me name some names to you. And as soon as I do, I see your brains will start turning over and you'll be thinking, oh, they made a lot of things, didn't they? Think of this: Georgine Averill, Grace Story Rockwell, Jean Orsini, Jessie Wilcox Smith, Ellen Clapsaddle, and of course, Rose O'Neal and Grace Drayton. All of these people began as illustrators, not as doll makers. They began as illustrators, and they worked within the doll industry to a point that people were able to see their work and say, hey, this would make a great doll. Or in some cases, these would make great postcards or great prints or towels or dresses or any other of the hundreds of different products that were being made. And so this became like just this ready marketplace. So I wanted to talk about two of the people from this time period I've mentioned already that fit into this time period, and that would be Rose O'Neal and Grace Drayton, because their artwork was turned in very specifically into dolls, and they were both involved in the suffrage movement. So I think that's really important. Interestingly, they were born 4 years apart. Rose O'Neal was born in 1874, and Grace Drayton was born in 1878. They were both born into very artistically inclined families, and they both studied art. Things that they had in relation, although I have not found any evidence that they ever knew each other, although it's hard for me to believe they didn't. They both studied art. They were both socially inclined. They both married and divorced twice. Both had strong family ties, and both became financially comfortable, and both were involved in the suffrage movement. So let me just talk to you about Rose O'Neal. She left New York City from Nebraska at age 19. Her family, her father was a bookseller, and I don't know. No one ever came out and said this in any of the writings I saw, but he was kind of like a floater, ne'er-do-well dreamer sort of guy. And she was born in Wilkes-Barre. In a very young age, he moved the whole family out to Nebraska, and they lived there through most of her childhood. And during that time, she studied art, she performed in theater. The whole family was involved in this type of thing. And I know you think Nebraska and art culture and all during the early 1900s, well, it was clearly there, and it inspired her, except that at age 19, she left Nebraska and went to New York. And that's when life just blossomed for her. She very quickly got assignments in magazines to do many illustrations, and her illustrations ranged from the series she called the Sweet Monsters, which were like monster kind of drawings, to very romantic scenes, to her beloved Cupies. She spent the next 15 years in New York and Paris and Italy. She traveled in intellectual circles in New York, and during this time, her Cupies first appeared in 1909, first in print and then in dolls. And I'll show you some of her dolls. We have showing you a Cupie in the original box, because she not only would have designed the doll, but she designed the box that it went in with a little Cupie poem, which she wrote, because she was a writer as well, wrote several novels. And then I want to show you a little Cupie. I tried to pick out a couple of slides of Cupies that I thought showed kind of like, might have been women almost geared toward being in the suffrage mood, because it's a little Cupie dressed in an American flag uniform, and obviously a little girl, even though Cupies are unisex. This was presented as a little girl in her uniform. Very, very charming little girl. And then a little pair of blunderboos waving American flags. And you can almost see her signs, Vote for Women, which I'll show you in a minute as you're looking at this. It's very interesting. And then finally, a monumental, because I just had to show you because it's one of a kind, and we had it recently, and I know some of you may not have seen it, this extraordinary Cupie Mountain, which was an assembly made on special commission to show many of the gambling, frolicking Cupies that she designed. During this time, she became heavily involved in the suffrage movement. She's one of the few people I've found that there is actual indication of her personal involvement in it. And by personal, I mean marching in parades, attending rallies. And here's a wonderful, wonderful view of her standing with her sister Callista, that they remained very close their entire life. And look at, they are just covered with posters, Vote for Women, suffrage, and all sorts of signs. There's one story that tells how she set up a little booth on the corner of, I think it was Broadway and 42nd Street in New York, where she was showing President Wilson and saying he wants suffrage, and so do we, and three big-size Cupies standing next to him. So she got very involved in all of these kind of movements to have this, and I think this is a wonderful, wonderful slide of her. And then another one where she's actually in a parade. This is a rally that's taking place, and if you look at this, the two women over on the right-hand side, on the far right is Rose O'Neill herself at the preparation for the women's suffrage workers. I tried to figure out the date on this. Is the New York Tribune is October 1915, so she will do the math in my head. I can't do that. Let me see, 25 and 15 is 40. She would have been like 41 years old here, marching in this parade. And then standing next to her is her sister Callista, that they had remained, again, very close throughout their adult life. And there was a pre-parade gathering of New York's women's suffrage workers in 1919, so just at the time that the amendment was about to be ratified. Well, she not only had her physical presence in the various suffrage movements, but she also designed much of her artwork. Not much of it, but some of her artwork was designed to help promote the entire movement. She was a very free thinker throughout her life. Just as she lived and what she believed, and she was mostly a terribly generous person. Ended up dying penniless because basically had given away all of the fortunes of money she made in her life from her Cupies, because she was caring and generous, and she sponsored people, and she helped feed people. There's a story about a hotel in New York that had an open contract with her, that there was a table set up and anyone who was hungry, who was an artist, could go in there and could eat on her pocket. Well, here's some of the artwork that she did in relation to the suffrage movement. The first one I think is really great because it is not the typical kind of drawing that you expect from her. And this is Suffrage Sacrifice Week, and asking people to put a few pennies in a box to help the cause. And this very elegantly dressed woman is actually holding a little baby who kind of looks like a Kewpie, but one of her artworks that she did to support that. And then using her actual Kewpies in some of the artwork, we have another one that says, "Give Mother the vote, we need it. Our food, our health, our play, our homes, our schools, our work are ruled by men's votes. Isn't it a funny thing that Father cannot see why Mother ought to have a vote on how things should be? Think it over." Very, very, very wonderful poster that was done. And another wonderful one, this was done as a postcard and as a poster, and it's just a wonderful little Kewpie marching across a cloud with a banner across his chest that say, "Women suffer, vote for women, equality, do I get your vote?" Great design. And that was an example of the work that she did. Now I wanted to show you our other person because I think she doesn't probably get as much attention as Rose O'Neill, and this is Grace Drayton. Grace Drayton was born Grace Eddies, then married young, became Grace Widersheim, then divorced that gentleman, then married again, became Grace Drayton, who she also divorced that man, but kept his name on most of her work throughout her life. Grace was not a New Yorker. She was a Philadelphia woman, born in Philadelphia, into a family of very fine print lithographers. And so you can see that there was an interest in what I would call popular art throughout her childhood, and she and her family were all tended to be quite talented, although she probably of the higher rank than any of them. She studied at the Philadelphia School of Design for Women. Again, this is part of that whole movement during this time of having more art schools designed to train and educate women. And she was a founding member of, this is a weird name, the Plastic Club, which sounds kind of weird, but it actually was a really, really high-ranking club for a women's art organization that was designed to promote women artists collaborating together and working together to support each other. So you can see that she was tightly involved in the development of women in the arts and being able to make artistic presentations of their work. So we want to show you some of the things that she did. This is an actual picture, a photograph of her, which you're seeing in her wonderful hat. And she was known as being a fashionista, and she remained this way throughout her life, although her style of dress changed with the times. This was her in the early 1900s. Her most famous features were the Campbell kids. But she designed so many other children and figures that were designed in that same kind of mode. And here's an example of, these were based upon her comic strip characters, Dolly Dingle and Bobby Blake. Again, done for the women's magazines that had such great demand for these. They all wanted to have their children's pages in the women's magazines. And to have these artists who could not only create the characters, but could write little storylines that went with them, was great for them. And this is a Dolly Dingle and Bobby Blake based on the comic character, her comic series that she did. And these were surprisingly made in Japan. Rose O'Neill was really, going back to her for a moment, was really highly sponsored by George Borgfeldt. I mean, he really mentored her. He contracted with her. He developed her Kewpie theme so that it made her a fortune, and that took the marketing of it out of her hand. And go back on that to Martha Chase that I talked about before, who maintained her own marketing, promotion, and distribution her whole life. Both of these doll artists, Rose O'Neill and Grace Drayton, didn't do that. They designed the pieces, they did the artwork, and then they were largely given over to development and distribution by larger firms. So that's one of the things she did. And then she did this darling little dog that was produced by Horseman, and he was called Puppy Pippin, and he's an absolutely great little piece. Now, she became very involved in the suffrage movement too, and so many of the postcards her output was vast beyond actual physical dolls. She's in so many postcards, paper dolls. Oh, her paper dolls, phenomenal throughout. But she took some of her artwork and she translated it into helping support the suffrage movement. I haven't found any photographs of her actual physical, personal involvement in the suffrage movement, but I have found her artwork that does. And here's this wonderful postcard she did, Votes for Women, a spirit of 1776, and then she crossed it out, today, no taxation without representation. That was a great one. And then she did, for Valentine's Day, this is really a cute little Valentine, I'm a suffragette and I don't care who knows it. Because it was kind of like, there was always this cross current of people that really supported the whole suffrage movement, and then people who said, well, you really weren't really a woman if you really supported this movement, and so you better get back in the kitchen where you belong. And so here she was really kind of developing this theme. And it's really interesting, if you look at the hat this little doll is wearing, this little Valentine doll, it's very similar to the hat that you saw her wearing in the photograph of herself. So her characters always have these very outsized kind of expressions and faces and hats and costumes. And then this one, I love this one. So we know she did all of the Campbell Soup work for so many years, and the Campbell Kid dolls were developed from it and actually turned into, this is where she wasn't having really good representation in her marketing, because Germany in Hertel and Schwab produced their googly with the sculpted orange hair that was without any question, was exactly a duplicate of a Campbell Kid, but there was no licensing given to her, so she got nothing out of it, and that was kind of unfortunate. I always kind of defend George Borgfeld because I think he really did right by the female artists that he had working for him. But anyway, in this particular one, this little Campbell Kid, and look at this is great, read it. Votes for women, yes, you bet, that good times will reach us yet. When men folks know how housework feels, we'll have Campbell's soup at all our meals. And obviously a little jab at men who might come in one night and his wife has been busy with her suffrage work. And he said, well, you're giving us canned soup? And she said, well, I've been busy today. And so there's a little jab at that. And hey, guys, chip in here and you can help get dinner sometime. And we bet if you do, you'll be preparing Campbell's soup. A wonderful, wonderful suffrage thing. I wanted to then go into what I call the aftermath. When I started doing this talk, I wanted to have all three women. I wanted to have Rose O'Neill and Grace Drayton and Grace Story Putnam. But the more I read, and there's some wonderful pieces about Grace Story Putnam in some of the early doll books by Janet Joel, for example, in which they talk about personal reminiscences with her. And I read a lot of those, and I read a wonderful book on letters that she wrote in her later life. But I never have found any reference to her involvement in the suffrage movement at all, Grace Story Putnam. And it's just very, very curious to me. So that's why I decided there had to be a third period that we would call doll makers and the aftermath, those who benefited, 1920 to 1940. And if you recall at the beginning of this talk, I talked about Grace Story Putnam arriving in New York in 1920. 1920, and what happened in 1920? The 19th Amendment was ratified. But that's when she arrived with the model of her Bilo baby, and went around and tried to find someone who would create it and promote it and sell it for her, distribute it for her. And as we know, she did. Long story short, it became absolutely phenomenal. Here's a photograph of Grace Story Putnam in her early years at the turn of the century. And you can see how elegantly garbed she is. Now, Grace Story Putnam was a California girl. Make no mistake about it. She was born in California. And how did she fit in with these other doll makers that we've been talking about? First Rose O'Neill and then Grace Drayton, who both came from these very intellectual, arty families. Well, she was different. She came from a California environment. She had different training. She had a broken family life. Her family went from rich to poor. She got married young and lived in a starving artist world for about 10 or 15 years and gave up her own artistic dreams because she was very talented and had gone to an art school in San Diego, very talented, but gave those dreams up in order to support her husband's dreams of being able to promote his art. So they've traveled from California to Paris to New York and always back to California. And finally, just at the time, and always she was the family support. She kept the family together. And her own art dreams had dissipated. And finally, just at the time when the right to vote was being ratified nationally, she left her husband, came to New York, and gave herself 3 months to find a distributor for her doll of an infant baby. She brought her wax model of this doll to New York, and here you're seeing what it looks like. And that was produced into the Bilo baby. Probably more sales than any doll ever, except possibly Cupid's, and maybe later on Shirley Temple, and then later on Barbie. But made in so many different formats, from these little all bisque dolls to the porcelain Bilos with shaker holes in the top of their head that could be salt and pepper shakers, to the actual Bilo with its original pin. And then in another group, you're seeing they were made in many, many medium, from composition to wood. There was a brown complexion baby made, and made in many, many different sizes. She was taken care of by her distributor. She did the design, and she oversaw quality, but she didn't have to worry about the marketing or the selling of the dolls. In fact, the distributor very, very determinedly put the stamp on the doll body, none genuine without the signature, and protected her name and protected the copyright to the doll. And then finally, time went on, and she lived quite well, and she produced in 1930 her final design called the Flylow baby, and it came out just at the time of the Depression, so it never went off the ground, and she died penniless, and so did Rose O'Neal. And I don't know about Grace Drayton, perhaps she did too. But I wanted to tell you that there's no evidence whatsoever that she was involved in the suffrage movement. But she clearly could be said to be a benefactor of the movement, coming to New York at the very time it was ratified. Why wasn't she involved in the movement? I don't know. Was it her family background? Was it that she was in California and things were different there? They weren't as hidebound as they were in the New England states, and so maybe women always kind of felt freer there. We don't know why she didn't, or maybe it was simply because she was just too busy supporting her husband and raising their children and trying to make a living for them that she had no time to become involved in that. I don't know, but there's no evidence of this. I want to show you, however, that times do change, and she changed as well, because I want to show you a photograph. This is the original photograph that we showed you when she first, about 1900, in her early days. And then this photograph of her in the mid-1920s, and look how she changed. So this could be kind of it's not a symbol of her benefiting from the suffrage movement, but it is a symbol of how times change and people went with it. Now, there were other female doll makers of this era, and they include Georgine Averill, who began as a doll artist, and then she evolved into the owner of her own large firm. And most notably, and I will end with this because I really want this doll artist and doll company to be brought more into the mainstream of doll collecting and stop being thought of as, oh, a modern doll. And that is Beatrix Alexander. Beatrix Alexander came into her own. She was born right at the beginning of the century, and she came into her own just at the time that the amendment was being ratified, the suffrage amendment, and she grew from there. She came from nothing. She came from poverty. She built a company that could largely be said to be one of the largest doll companies that existed in the world. She did her own design. She did her own marketing. She did her own business. She was in complete control and produced an outstanding body of work. And I think much of this can be credited to the suffrage movement in America that helped support her. So much more to learn on this subject, and I would be so grateful if all of you could get really involved in this. And hey, I'd love to get together a whole theme of an auction on dolls of the suffrage movement, either designed during this time, influenced by it, or made to represent women of the suffrage movement. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope you're having a wonderful time at the On Time Online event. This is great. Thank you. Bye-bye.